main street that went down to the schools and there was a dairy farm. And I ran up my house.
Gotta step up.
Okay, we're going to get started. There's another tray of these tarts, so please eat to your heart's delight. They're homemade by Barb, so thank you so much.
All right.
Yeah, come on. You got to do it.
Yeah.
And they're strategically placed in front of John, so John, you need to.
Yeah, I'll do some.
Wow.
I'm telling you, it's dangerous being in front of me.
I know. All right. Well, that's why Pastor Tony's sitting next to you.
And I actually
Just moved into
your email, looked at your seats, looked at your seats, and $2 in my pocket.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. This is our last session for this semester of Island Connect. Again, it's a shorter semester because I was traveling. Megan and I were traveling earlier in the year, and what I'd like to do is open up with the prayer. So, dear Lord, thank you for this time together. Please open our hearts and minds as we understand how your word came to be and has been shown to us, and help us better understand how to interpret it, how to better defend our faith and explain our faith and our doctrines to a non-believing world that so desperately needs you and your Son. And we pray this in your holy name. Amen. All right, so what we've been studying this semester, the title has been, Is the Bible Reliable? And I thought that was going to be a good kind of bite-sized study, because normally we go for like two and a half months or so. And I thought it was also topical. One, it was going to be fairly easy for me to put together because it's kind of right in my wheelhouse. It's that type of stuff that I really enjoy when I study stuff. But also, I think it's very apropos because it's a world that is now slanted toward automatically not believing anything having to do with religion, Christianity, the Bible, ancient texts. And as we talked about, if you're a young person growing up in this world, you are force-fed this diet that says, you know, the Bible's not reliable. They don't even know what the real text is. Even if they knew, it doesn't apply to us anymore. It's 2019. You know, give it the program. And so, even if you grew up in a Christian household or had a strong faith, you're going to eventually land some point, either, you know, when you're 18 or when you're 22 or whatever, into a world that is going to do everything, it seems like, to disavow you of your faith and shake that certainty that even the fundamental texts of Christianity are not true. You can't defend them. So, what I hoped that you would get out of the study, again, you're not going to remember all the details, but if you come out with some nuggets, like Bob was telling me, he had a discussion, you know, somebody asked him, well, you know, where did they come up with the books of the New Testament? And he was able, well, you know, 3 different ways, and that's cool. That's the whole point of why we're together, right? So,
Eat breakfast this morning and our conversation yesterday at Rotary. I mean, you know, it's just all the time around.
it's all the time because people are curious.
Yeah.
They're like, all right, you're a pastor, you're a Christian. Why do you think this stuff's even real? So, this is our final session. Again, the whole point of the Wednesday nights thing on Connect is to have everybody get a midweek pick-me-up, a fellowship, get to know some people, get to eat homemade tarts, and get better at interpreting Scripture. All the studies we've done on Wednesday nights are not necessarily Bible studies. They're basically studies to help you fill in the gaps about your Bible study, and give you more tools, a little more in-depth knowledge. So the whole point of this series was to understand the objections people have to believing that the Bible is reliable and authoritative. And again, I hope that this gives you some nuggets that you can use in your discussions with people. I want to shout out in this section to a guy named Dr. Dan Wallace. I was lucky enough about a year or two ago to get into I actually added a course to my seminary studies, and he is probably the best living textual critic for the Bible alive today. He works out of Dallas Theological Seminary, and he actually wrote the advanced Greek grammar that I had to go through, but he also put together a textual criticism course that he actually videotaped. It was like 20-something lectures, and it's just, you know, it was just awesome. So a lot of this stuff is rehashed from him. I usually don't do this, but I need a shout out to Dr. Wallace. Thanks so much for everything. All right, so the last objection, remember we talked about some objections. There's one objection that the world has to whether the Bible's authoritative and reliable, which is kind of more philosophical and theological. Like, is there a God? If there is a God, what does he have to do with me? And does anybody have the right to tell me what's right or wrong? I roll my own thing in the kind of postmodern worldview. There's no such thing as absolute truth. It's my truth, your truth. Those are kind of theological, philosophical objections in the background. We tackled that kind of in general in the first session. The next one was, well, you don't even have copies of the originals. So how can you even, who knew what these medieval monks did back in 1100? Who cares? I mean, these things were written in the 1st century AD. You don't even have anything close to the original copies. And we talked about that objection, and we saw that, yes, indeed, we have over 5,600 Greek manuscripts, even papyri that date within maybe even decades of the originals of some of the sections of some of the Gospels and stuff. And we have 10,000 Latin manuscripts. We've got 1 million different references, literally, from the early church fathers dating all the way from the 1st century, all the way back, of quoting the scripts that they were reading. So we have an incredible amount of witnesses to be able to reconstruct very early how this stuff came about. And then you say, well, all right, fine, you got a lot of manuscripts, a lot of them are old, good. The next objection would be, yeah, but how do you know you even got the right books? Who says that the letter to the Corinthians is more important than a lot of these other ancient documents that never made it into the Bible, and they were written at the same time or pretty close there? Why not the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Mary Magdalene and the secret Gospel of this? And it's probably, the church got together under Emperor Constantine, and they just voted and they shoved down the church's throat what books kind of aligned with what they thought everybody should believe. And all the books didn't make it in the Bible. They were kind of like losers. And of course now we have this Bible that was basically the winners. And we saw that by the time of the Emperor Constantine, it was already put together. So the 3 criteria that the church itself, the body of believers over the course of a couple hundred years had done was, one, were these letters and books of apostolic origin, right? So was it a Paul, or was it a Peter, or was it somebody that was one of their close followers, like a Luke or a Mark? Mark, remember, was a follower of Peter, wrote this down. That's one. A second thing would be universal acclaim, meaning by that time, all the churches all over the Roman Empire were using the same documents because they recognized they had authority, they had life-changing impact. They recognized that this stuff was inspired. And then third was orthodoxy, meaning all these books contain the true gospel as outlined very early on by Paul. And so a lot of these other extraneous documents were kind of weird. They were Gnostic texts. They were kind of secret knowledge things, sects and stuff. And then they never got into the Bible appropriately. So we saw how to dispel that objection. Now, this last objection I want to go over is in some ways a harder objection for most Christians. I don't know if you encounter it very often, but if you go to colleges, this is what you're going to hear. And it's, imagine you're an 18-year-old, you're raised in a Christian household, you go to your first freshman year, and then some professor's laying on you stuff like this. What good is it to say that the autographs, that is the original documents, were inspired? We don't have the originals. We only have error-ridden copies, and the vast majority of these are centuries removed from the originals and different from them, evidently in thousands of ways. There are more variations among our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. And that's the quote from that Dr. Ehrman, who's again at Duke, who wrote a book misquoting Jesus. So that stuff is out there. And the hard part is, in one way, it's right. So if you look at it, here's this from another, just a blog on the internet. You stated there are almost 6,000 Greek New Testament manuscripts, around 57 and 78 copies right now. Among them are 400,000 variants of differences, while there are only 139,000 words in the New Testament itself. And that's true. So if there's 139,000 words in the Greek New Testament, if you take all those manuscripts and look at every difference between every single manuscript we got, there are over 400,000 differences. That's like an average of 3 variants for every word in the New Testament. How can you possibly believe that you can get anywhere close to the original document when you have that many differences amongst all these ancient documents? How could you reconstruct it? How do you know that this variant is right and these 2 variants are wrong? That sounds like, if somebody tossed that at you, what were you going to say? You're wrong. That's not a great apologetic comeback. I mean, you're right, but that's not going to change your mind. That's not going to remove an intellectual stumbling block. And it certainly won't help your 18-year-old who's now getting confronted by this. That's what we're going to talk about. So in my world, in my brain, this is the best objection to go after because it's meaty and it's right in the wheelhouse. So I'm going to geek out on you tonight, but tough because you're here and you can't leave. I've been waiting all this time to get to this point. All right, so just a little baseline. There are over 5,800 and counting Greek manuscripts that date all the way from decades within the originals that were all written in the 1st century, all the way up to the Middle Ages, right? And there's different types of these documents. There's lots of different papyri. These are the earliest documents, typically written in Egypt, because that's the only place that those papyri could actually exist for 1,000 years to get to us and buried in the sand in a dry environment. But all the way from little scraps to, big chunks of the various books. We looked at, and I showed you a copy of Codex Sinaiticus, which is an example of when they, early on, they switched from papyrus, which is hard to make, strips of reeds and all that stuff, to what they would call parchment or vellum, which was like sheepskins or calfskins. And they would kind of scrape off all the hair and they dry it and they cut it. And then they would make codexes, which is basically the early books. Rather than a scroll, they would put these things together and then you have a book that you carry around. And I showed you Codex Sinaiticus, which is, we have 2 early complete Bibles that date all the way from the time of the Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century AD. And these are also called the types of writing on them. It's called majuscule or uncial. And all that means is all caps. So when they wrote, it was just all caps, like you see here, and no spaces, usually no paragraphs, no titles, no verse numbers. Verse numbers didn't come in until the 1400s. So it was hard to read. It's hard to write, but it meant, remember, this is an oral culture. It wasn't meant to read. It was meant to be read by a specialist out loud to people who probably couldn't read. Somewhere after that, they went to a script that was easier and faster to write, which was like lowercase, almost cursive, and that's called minuscule, kind of lowercase. And so we have and so from Middle Ages and early Middle Ages and the Dark Ages, a lot of the manuscripts we have are now minuscules. Okay, just to kind of show you some showing up. All right. So the first question that you have to ask or have to answer is, why are all these differences there? Why do you have 400,000 differences among these 5,600, 5,800 documents? Well, the main reason is they're all handwritten. When you print something, starting with the Gutenberg, Bible and stuff, you might have an error, but it's the same error. It's replicated all, so whatever text is there is set in stone because the printer's just printing multiple copies. They print different editions and stuff. So as soon as the printing press was invented, you have a whole lot less variance in any document because it's just, they can print 1,000 copies. Well, all this stuff was handwritten by a monk, by a non-professional scribe. It's sitting in their secret room in their house, because it's illegal to be a Christian. So when you're handwriting a copy of this document in that Greek text that's very hard to do, and most people aren't literate at that time, you will inevitably, no matter how good you are, you'll make one or two mistakes. Now, multiply that by 1,000 copies across a couple hundred years, you're going to have a lot of different variations. The earliest manuscripts that we have, and the earliest Christian manuscripts, were probably not done by professional scribes. Remember, book creation and copying in the ancient world, in Greek and Roman times, was a profession. If I was a historian, I'd write something, or I'd have my slave write it out as I dictated them. I'd edit it, then I'd give it to the professional scriptorium, and they would have people there that was just, all right, I want 10 copies of this for my friends. And you pay them the money, and they'd take them a couple months to do it out, and then you'd have 10 scrolls, and you can give it out. And then maybe if they really liked it, they'd take it locally to their scriptorium and reduplicate it. It was a pretty labor-intensive thing, and the people who did that were professionals, usually slaves, Greek slaves, especially for the Romans. Where many of the early Christian documents were done not by professional slaves. They might have been a couple there, but a lot of them were just faithful Christians who had to be secret about it. Matter of fact, in these various persecutions, the Romans would try to grab all these sacred writings and burn them. If you were found with a gospel or one of Paul's letters, that could be a death sentence. Right? Now, because, and this is a kind of an early mural picture of somebody on their lap with a codex, looking at one thing and letter by letter, word by word, making a copy of it. So why were there all these little changes? Well, there were first many unintentional changes or mistakes, usually in spelling. Remember, this is before dictionaries. And if only 1 in 10 people in the ancient world could read or write, what they heard was oral stuff. So if I said to you, write the following down, I went to there and if 3 people heard me say the same thing, 1 could probably mishear a word. Did he say but or and? Or there are words that sound the same, but they mean different things, because if you spell it differently, it's a different word. So there's a lot of that type stuff going on. So a lot of it in spelling, some grammar. Some of the scribes were very literate themselves. They were just almost like copying letters and words without truly understanding why that word is the way it is, because Greek is a highly, what we call, inflected language. So there's a lot of grammar to it, and the endings of all the words change. And if you're not very literate, you're just copying stuff, and you wouldn't even recognize when you make a mistake, because you probably couldn't really understand it anyway. There was also a lot of, imagine if you're a monk in the Dark Ages in some monastery, you've been doing this stuff for 6 hours now, and it's 45 degrees in the cell that you're at, and you've got this old, barely legible scroll, and you're trying to make a copy of it, and you're looking back and forth and back, and you skip a line, right? Because you went from this line to that line, or you did the line twice, right? Very easy to make those types of visual mistakes. Errors of hearing, because a lot of times they would have, especially in the monasteries, they would have somebody, a professional reader, stand in front of 3 or 4 monks, or however many there were, all hunched down at their little desk, and say, all right, in the beginning, there was the Word. And so everybody would say, in the beginning, there was the Word. So you can make 3 or 4 copies simultaneously, but it would take you literally months, because they'd have to read very slowly. And then, of course, if somebody's saying that, they'd be writing it down, and maybe the guy's too fast, and then, what did he say? Oh, I think he said this, So you get errors introduced in that. Sometimes there were mistakes or variants more intentional. And you see this a lot in the Gospels. Why? Because when you look at the 4 Gospel accounts, there are differences between them. How many times was Jesus in Jerusalem? What was the order of things happening? And so sometimes an overzealous scribe or monk would that doesn't exactly, I'm going to change this a little bit just to make it make it more close, all right? That's called harmonization. Sometimes they look at it, they might be working off a copy of a copy, and they look at it and they be like, that can't be right. That's a mistake in this copy. I'm going to correct it. When it actually was right, and they just introduced a mistake, right? Explanatory glosses, sometimes they would add things in the text. They didn't mean to add to the text, but they were trying to explain what this word meant, and then all of a sudden, after a couple copies, it becomes part of the text, right? They lose track. Sometimes some of these people, especially in the Middle Ages, they had lectionaries and liturgical uses for these books that they were things. So these were the books that were used in churches, they were used in the monasteries, Vespers, and they read out. And so they'd add things like, that's how you get in some of the versions. I know if you look thinking about the Lord's Prayer, what's the last line of the Lord's Prayer? Deliver us from evil. It's not in any of the early manuscripts. That was added liturgically by somebody because it was a great way to end that prayer in a service. And somehow that got into a manuscript, but then copied, and then all of a sudden it becomes part of the text. Errors of memory. You read a line, all right, in the beginning was the word, and you come over here and it's taking you 5 minutes to do that. In the beginning was a word, because you forgot what you just read, or you forgot what somebody just told you. Or probably a better one is fatigue. You're this emaciated monk who's in northern Germany or Ireland. It's freezing out. There's no central heat. You've been doing this every day for 5 years for 7 hours a day, and you're just tired. And some of the scribes are just not good. They're just sloppy. They don't pay enough attention. Some of them are great. Some of them aren't. Here's an example. Matthew 3:9. In the Greek, it's patera echomen ton Avraham. Okay? So what does that mean? It says that first one, patera echomen ton Avraham, means we have Abraham as our father. Right? The second one, patera echomen ton Avraham, it sounds exactly the same because it's supposed to sound exactly the same. The only difference is the letter in the middle. You see, in the top one, it's an omicron, an O, and the bottom, it's an omega, O. And by this time, by the Koine Greek time, they sound exactly the same. The only way you would know it's different is if you knew the context, or you can read it and see, oh, that's an omicron versus an omega. The meaning of the second one is, should we have